Lycidas by John Milton. Lycidas is arguably the greatest pastoral elegy in the English language. Written in 1637, it commemorates the death of Milton's college friend Edward King, who drowned in a shipwreck in the Irish Sea at the age of 25. However, the poem is rarely just about King, it is deeply personal to Milton. It is a meditation on his own fears of dying young before fulfilling his potential as a great poet and a biting critique of the corruption he saw in the church. Structure and movements. The poem does not follow a straight narrative but moves through swells of emotion, alternating between traditional pastoral imagery and angry interruptions. First, the invocation, premature death. Yet once more, O ye laurels, and once more. Milton begins by apologizing to the laurels and myrtles, plants associated with poetry, for plucking their berries before they are ripe. So the meaning is this is a metaphor for King's premature death, but also for Milton's own poetry. He feels he is not ripe, ready to write yet, but grief forces him to break his silence. The bond. He recalls how he and Lycidas King were shepherds together, students at Cambridge, nursed upon the self same hill. Second, the questioning of the nymphs. Where were ye nymphs when the remorseless deep closed over the head of your loved Lycidas? Following following classical tradition, he asked the nature spirits why they didn't save him. He realizes, however, that it wouldn't have mattered. Even Calliope, the muse, couldn't save her son Orpheus from being torn to pieces. If the greatest poet Orpheus couldn't be saved, what hope is there for others? Third, first digression, the problem of fame. Fame is a spur that the clear spirit doth raise. Milton suffers a crisis of confidence. Why work hard and deny oneself pleasure? Scorn delights and live laborious days to write poetry if a blind fury, death, can just cut the thin spun life at any moment. The answer, Apollo, the god of poetry, touches his ears and answers. Fame is not found in human praise but in heaven. God is the ultimate judge of a life's worth. Second digression, the corruption of the church. The hungry sheep look up and are not fed. The poem returns to the pastoral mode. St. Peter, the pilot of the Galilean lake, appears, but the tone turns angry. King was a clergyman, and Milton uses this to attack the corrupt ministers left behind. Blind mouths, a famous paradox. The bad clergy are mouths that do not speak or feed but only consume. And the warning is Milton warns of a two handed engine at the door, like a sword or a political instrument ready to strike down the corrupt church. Fifth one is the flower passage, false comfort. The speaker tries to comfort himself by imagining strewing flowers on Lycidas's hearse. He lists primroses, cowslips, and daffodils. The shift, he suddenly realizes that this is a false surmise. There is no body to bury. Lycidas is lost in the whelming tide, tossing in the ocean. This is a moment of deepest despair. Sixth, the consolation, resurrection. Weep no more, woeful shepherds, weep no more. The mood shifts abruptly from despair to triumph. The speaker realizes Lycidas is not dead but reborn. The sun simile. Just as the sun sinks into the ocean at night but rises again, Lycidas has mounted high through the power of Christ, him that walked the waves. Lycidas becomes a genius of the shore, a guardian spirit for other travelers. The famous ending. At last he rose and twitched his mantle blue. Tomorrow to fresh woods and pastures new. The poem ends in the third person, an omniscient voice describing the swain or poet. The poet stops singing, adjusts his cloak, and prepares to move on. So Milton has purged his grief and his fear. He has faced death and found faith. He is now ready to leave the pasture, that is Cambridge or the elegy, and move on to fresh woods, the great epic poetry of Paradise Lost. Key themes. First one, the vocation of the poet. Is poetry worth the sacrifice? Milton concludes that true fame is spiritual, not earthly. The pathetic fallacy. Nature is depicted as mourning with the poet. The willows and the hazel copses green shall now no more be seen. Then water imagery. Water is both the killer, the drowning, and the savior. Christ walking on the water and the living streams of heaven. John Milton's Lycidas belonged to the type of pastoral elegy. It was written in 1637 to mourn the death of Edward King, Milton's Cambridge friend who drowned in a shipwreck in the Irish Sea. So, the poem's form and structure. It is an irregular verse form, not strictly stanzaic, written in iambic pentameter with variations. There is a blend of classical, Christian, and personal elements. The major themes are death and mourning, futility and immortality of poetry, nature and loss, true versus corrupt clergy, Christian resurrection and hope, poet's vocation and responsibility. Summary. First of all, the invocation and grief. The poet invokes the muses reluctantly, feeling unprepared to write poetry so early in life. Yet once more, royal laurels. Next, pastoral mourning. Milton uses shepherd imagery. Lycidas, Edward King, is portrayed as a shepherd whose flock mourns his loss. Third, nature's indifference. Nature could not prevent Lycidas' death, raising questions about divine justice. Fourth, attack on clergy, corrupt clergy. That is a digression. Milton criticizes corrupt church leaders, blind mouths, who misuse their sacred office. This section transforms the poem from pastoral elegy into social and religious criticism. Next is consolation through Christianity. Lycidas is not dead, he has risen and lives with Christ. Weep no more, woeful shepherds, weep no more. Then, closing renewal. The poet returns to earthly life, symbolizing hope and continuity. So, the pastoral elegy conventions used here are first of all the invocation of muses, which is a classical opening, then shepherd imagery, Lycidas as shepherd, then nature mourning, the flowers, valleys, they mourn because of the death of Edward King. Then questioning faith, why the good die young? Then consolation, Christian resurrection. Imagery and symbols, shepherd or folk, that is poets and clergy. Flowers, youth and mortality. Sea, death. Saint Peter, true spiritual authority. Sun imagery, death and rebirth. So the tone is mournful, reflective, indignant in clergy criticism, and hopeful at the ending. Important lines for quotation are yet once more, royal laurels, and once more. Fame is a spur, blind mouths, weep no more, woeful shepherds, weep no more. So in the poem, there is a combination of classical pagan mythology with Christian theology. And it transforms pastoral elegy into moral and religious commentary and establishes Milton's identity as a serious poet with prophetic authority. So, Lycidas is a pastoral elegy. Lycidas represents Edward King, blind mouth refers to corrupt clergy, and the final consolation of the poem is based on Christian resurrection. Then, when compared with Shelley's Adonais, that is a personal grief versus philosophical mourning. And when compared with Gray's Elegy, it's pastoral myth versus universal meditation. And when compared with Spenser's Astrophel, there is a similar elegiac tradition. In the opening of Lycidas, what two plants does the speaker mention? One representing poetic fame, laurels, and the other love or death, myrtles. Laurels and myrtles brown. The answer was there in the question itself. The speaker in Lycidas states that a dash constrained and sad occasion dear compel him to write the poem. Bitter constraint. According to the speaker, why must a poem be written for Lycidas? Because Lycidas himself was a poet who knew how to build the lofty rhyme. Who does the speaker invoke to help him write his elegy for Lycidas? The sisters of the sacred well, who are the muses. What is the speaker's personal motivation for writing a song for listeners, hoping for a similar favor in the future? He hopes some gentle muse will favor his own distant urn and bid peace to his shroud. How does the speaker describe his shared pastoral past with Lycidas? They were nursed upon the self-same hill and fed the same flock. The rural songs the speaker and Lycidas played were tempered to what instrument? The oaten flute. In the description of their pastoral life, what mythological figures would dance to the speakers and Lycidas' songs? Rough satyrs and fauns with cloven heel. Who is the older figure mentioned who loved to hear the songs of the speaker and Lycidas? Old Demetus. To what three destructive things does the speaker compare the loss of Lycidas' song to a shepherd's ear? Canker to the rose, taintworm to hearts, and frost to flowers. Excuse me. In a classic convention of pastoral elegy, the speaker asks, where were ye, dash, when the remorseless deep closed over the head of your loved Lycidas? Nymphs. The speaker dismisses the idea that the nymph's presence could have saved Lycidas by alluding to which mythological figure whose mother, a muse, could not save him. Orpheus. What river was Orpheus's gory visage sent down after he was torn apart? The swift Hebrus. What question does the speaker ask about the value of his poetic vocation, wondering if it's better to live a life of pleasure? Alas, what boots it with incessant care to tend the homely, slighted shepherd's trade? In questioning his life's work, the speaker considers sporting with two female figures from classical pastoral poetry. Who are they? Amarla, sorry, Amaryllis and Naira. I don't know whether the pronunciation is correct. What is described as a spur that the clear spirit doth raise and the last infirmity of noble mind? Fame. What figure with abhorred shears is said to slit the thin spun life just as a poet hopes for fame? The blind fury. Which god replies to the speaker's despair about fame, touching his ears to impart wisdom? Phoebus Apollo. According to Phoebus, true fame is not a plant that grows on mortal soil but lives and spreads by the witness of whom? All judging Jove. Who is the first figure in the procession of mourners called the Herald of the Sea who comes to defend Neptune, Triton. According to the Herald of the Sea, what was the state of the winds and sea when Lycidas drowned? The air was calm, and not a blast had strayed from his dungeon. The poem blames the drowning of Lycidas not on the sea but on what object, described as fatal and perfidious? The bark, the ship. Who is the second monarch described as a revered sire with a mantle hairy and bonnet sedge representing Cambridge University? Camus. What question does Camus ask, mourning the loss of his dearest pledge? Ah, who hath reft, quoth he, my dearest pledge? Who is the third and final mourner in the procession, described as the pilot of the Galilean lake? Saint Peter. What objects does the pilot of the Galilean lake carry, representing his authority in heaven? Two massy keys of metals twain, gold and iron. St. Peter's speech is a digression that critiques what group of people? Corrupt and unworthy clergy. St. Peter calls the corrupt clergy dash mouths for their spiritual ignorance and greed. Blind mouths. In St. Peter's metaphor, what happens to the hungry sheep, the congregation, under the care of corrupt clergy? They look up and are not fed, but are swollen with wind and rot inwardly. Besides neglect from their shepherds, what grim wolf also devours the flock daily? The grim wolf is generally interpreted as the Catholic Church or Satan. What mysterious object does St. Peter say stands ready to smite once and smite no more, prophesying judgment on the corrupt church? The two-handed engine. After the dread voice of St. Peter, the speaker calls for the return of which muse? The Sicilian muse. Following the procession of mourners, what does the speaker ask the valleys to cast upon Lycidas' hearse? Their bells and florets of 1,000 hues. The speaker acknowledges that decorating a hearse for Lycidas is a false surmise. Why? Because his body was lost at sea and cannot be interred. There does the speaker speculate Lycidas' bones may have been hurled beyond the stormy Hebrides, the bottom of the monstrous world. The speaker invokes an angel from the great vision of the guarded mount to do what? Look homeward and melt with ruth, pity. In the poem's turning point, the speaker commands the shepherds to do what? Weep no more. The poem offers Christian consolation by stating that Lycidas is not dead, but has done what? He has sunk low but mounted high. The resurrection of Lycidas is compared to what celestial body which sinks in the ocean but rises again in the morning? The day star, the sun. Through whose dear might did Lycidas rise again after sinking beneath the waves? In sorry, him that walked the waves, Christ. In heaven, what is Lycidas now doing among other groves and other streams? Through whose dear might did Lycidas rise again after sinking? In heaven, what is Lycidas now doing among other groves and other streams? He laves his oozy locks with pure nectar and hears a unexpressive nuptial song. In a direct reference to the book of Revelation, what do the saints in heaven do for Lycidas? They weep the tears forever from his eyes. What new role is Lycidas given in his apotheosis? He is a genius of the shore, a protective spirit for those at sea. In the poem's conclusion, how is the narrator who has been singing this song described? As an uncouth swain. What is the final line of Lycidas signifying the poet's resolution to move on from his grief to new poetic challenges, tomorrow to fresh woods and pastures new? What bitter, constrained, and sad occasion, dear, compels a speaker to write his elegy for Lycidas? The premature death of his friend and fellow poet. The opening lines explicitly state for Lycidas is dead, deader his prime, identifying the death of his peer as the impetus for the poem. In the poem, how is the past relationship between the speaker and Lycidas primarily depicted? As fellow shepherds sharing a simple pastoral life and poetic pursuits. The text details how they fed the same flock by fountain, shade, and rill and tempered rural ditties to the autumn flute. When the speaker despairs over the value of a poet's life, what alternative does he suggest is better done as others use? To engage in simple hedonistic pleasures with figures like Amaryllis and Neaera. The speaker explicitly mentions to sport with Amaryllis in the shade or with the tangles of Neaera's hair as an easier path. According to Phoebus's divine intervention, what does true fame, the fair garden ultimately reside? No, in the heavenly judgment and perfect witness of all judging love. Yes. Phoebus' reply clarifies that true fame lives and spreads aloft and is determined by Jove's final pronouncement of each person's deeds. After the Herald of the Sea questions the winds and waves, what is identified as a direct cause of the shipwreck that killed Lycidas? The fatal and perfidious bark itself suggesting a structurally unsound or cursed ship. The poem concludes it was a ship built in eclipse and rigged with curses dark that was at fault. The pilot of the Galilean lake who bears two massy keys delivers a stern speech primarily criticizing whom? Corrupt and self serving clergy who neglect their followers. His speech condemns those who, for their belly's sake, creep and intrude and climb into the fold, a clear metaphor for unworthy clergymen. Why does the speaker call the act of imagining flowers on Lycidas's hers a false surmise? He remembers that Lycidas's body is lost at sea and cannot be buried. He breaks the pastoral fantasy by acknowledging the reality, whilst thee the shores and sounding seas wash far away wherever thy bonds are hurled. How does the poem ultimately offer consolation for the death of Lycidas? By reimagining him as resurrected in heaven where all tears are wiped from his eyes. The poem shifts to a triumphant Christian vision, stating Lycidas sunk low but mounted high and is now in the blessed kingdoms meek of joy and love. After his resurrection, Lycidas is given a new role. What is he to become? The genius of the shore, a guardian spirit for those in the perilous flood. The poem explicitly states, henceforth thou art the genius of the shore, and thy large recompense, and shalt be good to all that wander. What is the meaning of the poem's final two lines spoken by the narrator about the uncouth swain, the poet? He has processed his grief and is ready to face new life experiences and poetic subjects. This ending signifies his closure on his mourning for Lycidas and a hopeful, forward looking turn toward the future and his own continued work.